Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. Hello friends, I'm Dr. Janine Anderson, and today we have a very special episode of the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. We have our guest, who is the dietitian for the show, Kate Merkle. Kate has a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and food science from Colorado State University. Go Rams! She also has a master's degree in public health from Benedictine University and is a certified Daring Way facilitator. Daring Way is Brene Brown's certification program, so that's pretty awesome that she has that, especially as a dietitian. This is her 12th year practicing as a registered dietitian. She has a private practice in Chicago where she specializes in working with eating disorders. Kate, welcome.
Hi, Janine. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so lucky to have you as our dietitian for the podcast.
Well, great. I was really excited to be a part of this, and I feel really grateful and honored. So thanks again.
Likewise, because I think that you're the Yoda of dietitians.
Oh,
I think you're so
sweet.
skillful. Can I tell everybody that you have a Yoda figurine in your office?
I do. I can see him now. And yeah.
Which is so amazing. Yeah. If I were your client and I walked in and I saw your Yoda figurine, I would instantly think, I'm going to do whatever this woman says, because she'd say, oh yeah, I need you to go to Dagobah and practice moving stuff around with your mind. And I'd be like, all right, if that's what it takes to recover, that's what I'm going to do. All right. So we're primarily going to talk about all or none thinking today. That's our topic that we've picked. But I think it'd be helpful to get started with how we met and how we know each other.
Absolutely. So we met when we were working at La Luna in the branch in Fort Collins, Colorado.
Uh-huh.
And I was the dietitian. I started there, gosh, I'm not sure what year exactly, maybe 2006 or 7. And yeah, that's how we met.
Right. So we were both working at an eating disorder treatment center in Fort Collins. And I was working there as a therapist, and Kate was working there as the dietitian. And that center had outpatient services and then also intensive outpatient services. So that's how we met and worked together on the team there and how we got to know each other. And that's how I know up close that you're really wonderful and very, very skilled.
Yes, I could say ditto. I feel the same about you. That's how we got to learn about each other and understand each other's, like teaching styles and working relationship. And so, yeah, I felt like from the get-go, we've always been on the same page and had philosophies that align when it comes to recovery and doing all the work that you need to do in order to recover.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I bet listeners of this podcast are going to want to know about how you got into dietetics, how you became a dietitian, and how that interest arose for you.
Yeah. So I actually, with a great smile, tell the story because it really has been such a big part of my life. So food in general food and cooking and baking have been a big part of my life. So my grandfather on my mother's side was a baker. And so I grew up cooking and baking a lot with him and my grandfather, my grandmother. And then it wasn't until I remember, I think I was like 17, and my mom and I sat down to do kind of the work that you do to pick a school, or what do you want to study? What do you want your life to look like?
Right.
And she said, Kate, we got to tackle this. What do you want to do? And earlier that that year, I had taken a road trip with my dad, my uncles, and some of my cousins, and we all went out to Colorado. And that was the first time I'd ever experienced Colorado. And I remember taking a nap in the caravan that we were in and waking up and mountain walls and just the beautiful landscape of Colorado. And I thought, that's something I know for sure. I need to live in Colorado and be in Colorado because it's just such a beautiful and magical place.
Right. It really is.
Yeah, it really
it's gorgeous.
is. Yeah. So I remember when my mom asked me that, I said the two things that came out of my mouth, I said, I know that I want to study food and I know that I want to live in Colorado. And at that point in my life, being 17, I didn't know about all the careers in food. And so my mother, being a registered nurse and working with all sorts of clinicians throughout her career, she said, oh, you could be a dietitian. And I remember lighting up thinking, well, what's that? And so I said, well, what is that? And she gave me a brief description of the array of settings that I could work in. So if I wanted to work in a hospital or a clinic, or I could work even for a school. And there's just various, because my passion at that point was really about food and cooking. And so I was just thought, oh, I'd be a chef.
Yeah.
And so she said, well, you could cook as a dietitian. You could get into that. It would just open up a lot. So that was it. And that actually was such a transitional point in my life because I think today, I mean, that's what I've always been doing. I went off to school to study dietetics and concentrate in dietetics and then go on to do the dietetic internship and become a dietitian. And it's just what I've been doing the whole time. And I know in for a lot of folks, that's rare. A lot of times it's actually more common to change careers. I think it's more common to change professions and try different career tracks over the course of a lifetime. For me, it was just so fitting. And when I look back at my life, my grandfather being a baker, my mom pulling in the healthcare piece and growing up with a nurse, and then my father, who's a photographer and an artist, he is an entrepreneur. And so that kind of way of life was also a part of my upbringing, which is like working for yourself, and looking at the aspects and the pros and cons for yourself. But it was always kind of a message that I grew up with of like, why not work for yourself? And so I think that blend, and really just that time when my mom said, what do you want to do? And I said, I know for sure I want to study food and live in Colorado. And then after that, it was just a matter of time of looking at schools and applying and just taking it piece by piece and taking that route. Yeah.
Right. I feel similarly because I wanted to be a psychologist since I was a little kid, which I suppose is a bit unusual for a kid. But my father's a physician and my mom did more case management sort of work. So I feel like psychology is kind of that blend too, of the science piece and then of really wanting to help people. And now that's expanded a little bit because now I'm out here podcasting and writing and doing fun creative stuff.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you'd also be willing to talk about how you got into the specialty of eating disorders, because I know a lot of my clients who have gone to dietitians or nutritionists in the past who did not know about eating disorders or didn't work with that population. And it really is a really important specialty area.
Absolutely. So I think the number one reason why I do the work I do is because I have my own recovery. So at that time when I was sitting with my mom, I did have such a passion and a love, and I feel comfortable saying an obsession with food at that time. I didn't have an eating disorder. And it wasn't until I got to school and I'm studying and I'm knocking things out and moving through my coursework in my first semester that I had another like pivotal moment where I went to the doctor at the CSU Health Center, and Dr. Higgins, if I can give a shout out for her. I don't think she's still practicing, but fabulous, insightful doctor.
We'll give a shout out to the Health Network in general. There are some good people working there.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of my recovery happened there. And I just said to her, kind of that as I'm leaving, it's not even a big deal. I'm kind of just, mentioning it in a whisper. I'm like, one other thing is I just can't seem to stop eating. And she wrote a script for me to see the dietitian. And that's at that first visit with the dietitian, Chris Bachman, at the health center. She never even said, do you have an eating disorder? She never diagnosed me with it. I think her question of how often do you think about food?
Right.
And
you're like all the time, all day. Is that a problem?
Yes. I remember my body actually gave like an exhausted, like kind of threw my hands up and melted in the chair with an eye roll. And when I noticed my reaction to her question, that's when I got the insight of this, I don't want to say this isn't normal, but this is beyond like a normal relationship with food. This has kind of gone awry, and that this is disordered and an eating disorder. And so that was my clue of like, okay, yeah, I have an eating disorder. And so it's funny that I find it funny, and I just find it so fascinating that so much of my life food was involved in, and how much love I have for food. I still love food to death. It's such a fun thing in my life, and I engage with it every day. And so I love it. And that looked all sorts of different ways. There wasn't always a time, through recovery, when food was so freeing, and I could have such a free and flexible relationship with it.
Of course.
So, yeah. So, okay. So then going through my own recovery really helped me to shape my skills as a dietitian, helping other individuals recover.
Right.
So, yeah. So I went into dietetics just thinking a couple of things. One, I really had this passion for cooking and food and baking, and just understanding information. And there was also a big part of me that wanted to raise a healthy family. And I felt like knowing more about food and cooking could do that. Mm-hmm. So when I first signed up at Colorado State, I had no idea really because I didn't know I had an eating disorder. Right. I think that it kind of went on to years because it didn't, at that time, this was the mid to late 90s. There just wasn't, my eating disorder started off, I mean, it's kind of debatable in my head, but I think when I first started feeling the struggle with it, it presented as binge eating disorder.
Yeah.
That really wasn't talked about.
Right. And I would say that it's still working. We're still working in the field to get it as much credibility and to have people take it as seriously as it needs to be taken.
Absolutely.
But when you were talking, I can absolutely relate with you about loving food. So my eating disorder presented as anorexia, and I would really restrict my calories and excessively over exercise. And I also abused diet pills for several years. And I remember, and people still will say this around me. They'll say, oh, I could never be anorexic. I love food too much. And I always tell them, I love food too. But at the time, I just hated myself more than I loved food. And I think it's so great that you also can model that it's okay to love food and that we're supposed to enjoy it. It's this wonderful gift. And when our relationship with it is healthy, it's not a problem to enjoy that pleasure of preparing it and cooking it and eating it. So I'm so glad you said all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can run into trouble and this kind of, I feel like, is a nice...
are you going to say?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking about that. Like, this is kind of reminding me of the black and white thinking, right? Like,
right.
Food is not just fuel. And when we think about, we can get into trouble when we think about it just as fuel, because what happens is we miss out on the pleasure component of food. Mm-hmm. So I like to think of it, like sleeping. We need to sleep. It's like a function in our life. It's for survival. We're not going to do well when we don't get enough sleep. And I can make a conscious decision to take a cat nap in the afternoon because I want to, because it feels good. And maybe that's not so much part of a function or a, like a...
It's not as necessary. Right.
But it's part of the quality of my life. And so we do eat for social and emotional reasons at times. And making a conscious decision to do that, even when we're not hungry or don't have the feelings of gentle hunger. Actually, I was traveling with family, and I wasn't that hungry. I was kind of in a neutral place. And my sister grabbed my hand and said, "Will you split these nachos with me?" And I looked at her with a smile. I said, "Yes."
Right.
And we got a really nice plate of nachos and we split them. And it was the whole situation and the whole experience of the moment that I wanted to be a part of.
Right.
And so being able to flex with eating and food allows me to have the quality of life that I want, and it allows me the freedom really that I want. And then I think getting a plate of nachos with your sister, that's just really fun, right?
Exactly. And it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I want to back up just a bit, and I want to talk about, just give the definition of all or none thinking. So all or none thinking is a form of what's called cognitive distortions. And this isn't to say your thoughts are messed up and you're being so irrational, but it's the term for how these thought patterns are. Distorted means just that they're not accurate. Doesn't mean that you're bad or you're not smart or whatever. And all or none thinking is as black and white thinking. Sometimes it's also called dichotomous thinking. That's a little bit more of a technical term. So I define it as being characterized by a lack of nuance and a lack of flexibility in your thoughts. So with all or none thinking, things are divided into absolutes and extremes. You're perfect or you're terrible. Either you're kicking ass in recovery or you've made no progress at all. Either you eat really, quote, healthy foods or you're on a fast food bender. So that's kind of how I define all or none thinking. Kate, will you give us some how you see all or none thinking, like how that comes up in your work with clients?
Sure. I would say the most common, or one of the most common ways that I see it is when we're judging foods as good or bad, and mainly healthy and unhealthy.
Right.
I have a lot of clients, I own my body. I ask them, what does that mean? Then we kind of look at what foods that are, the client likes or doesn't like. I always like to really bring it back to how does that food feel in your body? But to answer your question, it's really about, judging. I hear a lot of times, well, fat is bad, being fat is bad. These foods are bad. And then, it's basically categorizing foods in that black and white. This is good, this is bad.
Right. So when we look at the eating disorder, I always think of the eating disorder, and this is not original to me. This is, I think, the first time I learned of it. This is Jenny Schaefer's concept, who wrote the book Life Without Ed, which everybody in recovery should read. But she talks about how the eating disorder is something other than, that the eating disorder produces certain types of thoughts and that those thoughts are predictable. And part of that is having all or none thinking and really rigid rules around food. So kind of what you were speaking to about how their eating disorder will cause them to really categorize foods in this either or way. That's a good food, I can eat that. That's a bad food, I can't eat that. And it can be really difficult to cultivate the flexibility around it, that foods aren't good or bad. All foods serve all different kinds of purposes.
Exactly. I regularly find myself saying it's not what we're eating, but how and why. And looking at that.
Say more about that.
Sure. So, let's say a client is like explaining to me when I ask about the good or bad foods, I think asparagus is a good food. And so I'll say, okay, so then I want you to tune into the foods and see how they feel in your body. So I'll put my hands out and be like, this much asparagus, and maybe I'll just cup my hands together, could feel good in your body. And then I'll put my hands out like a big grizzly bear, and I'll say, how does this much asparagus feel in your body? So how does this much of any food feel in your body?
Right.
So then we can pick other foods that are fear foods of the person. Let's just say pizza pops in my head. That might be a fear food for this client. And so a couple of slices, can you give yourself some permission to sit down and have a couple of slices of pizza when you want that? And again, can you pull on the mindfulness skills around mindful eating? And then how does that feel in your body versus your head kind of driving and running the show and saying, this is bad, you shouldn't eat this.
Right.
So I try to get them to look at how and why they're eating versus what they're eating. And then collect the data of how does that food feel in your body? So what energy does it give you? How mood wise do you feel? What satisfaction you feel from that food? So I like to look at all of that. And even other things like, am I eating on the run? Am I eating really fast? Am I, and then aside from all the other emotional things, like, am I eating to soothe and numb and cope?
Right.
Or any behavior to soothe, numb, and cope.
Yeah. And then it's just, to me, sometimes I'll talk with people about how, to me, I'll compare it to shopping, that we have to purchase things in order to continue living our lives. We need certain supplies. And that if every time you had really difficult emotions, you went shopping and you bought a bunch of stuff, it would probably cause you some problems. I think that that's similar to food, that if every time you have, difficult emotions to get through, you use food in this way, that could cause you some problems. But it's not because having to buy things and going shopping is bad. It's just part of our life. And it's the relationship with it that I think matters a lot more.
Exactly. And so that's kind of how I like to get in and tease out, where are you demonizing foods, what foods are getting, and what are the messages around, like, where did that come from? Where did you first hear that? Whose voice is that telling these messages?
Right.
And then because that's usually the starting, a lot of times the starting place of when we can relax and practice letting go of the judgments around the foods. We find that those foods can come into our lives, and this is over time, we get more exposure with those foods. They can come into our lives in a very flexible, more comfortable, normal, I guess you could say in quotes, normal way of like I eat this food, I eat till I and some satisfaction, and then I'm finished and I can move on and do other things. So it's that labeling the foods good and bad that get us into trouble, because sometimes folks will even find that they've labeled a food as good or bad and find themselves craving that food and wanting that food. They haven't even eaten it yet, but they want it.
Right.
And then that's enough to put them in a shame spiral.
Yeah. So explain what a shame spiral looks like for someone with an eating disorder.
A shame spiral, I feel like it quickly, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I want that food, or I can't believe I'm hungry again. It's only 11:30. It's not noon yet. Something's wrong with my body. I can't trust my body. I can't trust myself. And then it turns into, if this keeps happening and keeps continuing, see, this is never ending. This keeps happening to me. Every day I want these foods. Every day I'm eating these foods, fill in the blank, or every day these behaviors are getting in. Yeah. I'm going to, and then it really spirals in. Yeah.
It sounds like a lot of catastrophic thinking with this layer of shame and judgment and feeling like you shouldn't be having those thoughts or feelings or desires for those foods. But really all those things are normal, that your body gets hungry at different times and that you want different foods throughout the course of a day. All that sounds just really normal to me.
Yes.
All right. So I also wanted to talk about, with all or none thinking, how that plays into keeping the eating disorder going. because I think that every eating disorder is to keep itself going. And all or none thinking has this really unique way of doing that, where it kind of puts you in this bind. Either you do everything perfectly all the time, you always choose the healthy food, you always eat the right amount, you never overeat, you do everything perfectly, or you're terrible, you get to shame yourself in multiple ways, and the feelings of shame ultimately increase your urges to use eating disorder behaviors. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how with your work will have a lot of difficulty having a lot of all or none thinking, how that happens, how it ultimately creates more eating disorder thoughts or more eating disorder behaviors.
Yes, I usually start off with helping the client to understand reinforced. And so when their eating disorder thoughts are telling them that this food is good or bad, or this behavior is good or bad, or this way to live is good or bad, and that allows us to continue to use behaviors or to continue to restrict, to soothe, we end up reinforcing that and really strengthening it. I once was at a meditation class and heard the teacher explain, when you go ahead and start to saw on a log, how difficult it is to get that groove going. And so I think that the eating disorder, that groove has been really worked on and really reinforced for so long over time that it's easy to slip into, and it's a really deep and entrenched groove. And so working on reframing, working on practicing compassion and trying to let go of black and white thinking, and also helping the client to see that that's a setup. That's a big setup. When I judge foods as good or bad, I tend to then be rigid with eating, and then behaviors happen.
Right.
And so when they can start to identify what sets them up and what triggers them to use behaviors later in the day or the next week, really pack in the work that they need to do around letting go, and whatever skills that they plug in that they've learned over time through their work in recovery to help them really diffuse and let go of that black and white thinking. And it's just a practice. It's like building a skill, like which we have to practice. We have to make mistakes before we can get fluent in that. And so a lot of times the first step is just awareness. So what foods do you judge? Where do you find yourself judging? Even our body. Where do you judge your body? Where do you judge other people's bodies? Even like I said, the time, like, are you judging, it's 11:30 in the morning and you're finding your body is hungry and ready for lunch, but you've made up a rule that says you can't eat until noon, or fill in the blank with however the rules look.
Sure.
And then and those rules get rigid, and then if we break them in any way, like, my biggest fear is that my body will never stop gaining weight and I'll be worthless. I really think that it really, for most of my clients, comes down to a self-worth. Kind of reminds me of that Stuart Smalley character in the 90s. where
Yes, I was just talking with my co-producer last night, and I was telling her that I still get a little nervous before I record the podcast episode. And she said, you need to do some Stuart Smalley stuff. Just get out there and say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me.
Right.
Yeah, but kind of going back, you said so many wonderful things in there. Seeing the all or none thinking as a setup, and that really what it is a trick that your eating disorder uses to trap you into either doing things perfectly you're going to fail at, or feeling terrible about yourself when you can't meet that impossible standard, which causes more eating disorder behaviors.
Exactly. And so then that groove in that log gets reinforced and deeper and deeper. And then before we know it, we're kind of on autopilot, and we're automatically falling into behaviors. And we've kind of lost sight of our values and how the type of life we want to live. So yeah, it definitely is a setup. And And so getting into the awareness around, so it's just journal, hunger, fullness, and then maybe thoughts around what they're eating, when they're eating, how they're eating, and just kind of get a clue of like, when my mind starts to think in this way, I feel like my eating disorder is pretty active. How can I reinforce my wisdom and the authentic parts of me and not reinforce the eating disorder? And also I have my clients personify that part of them. I think this is very common.
I love to do that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Jenny Schaefer, calling it Life Without Ed, naming. And a lot of times I'll have people role play with that part and talk to that part, because I think when my clients can calm that part down, so a lot of times I think of like, can go to that part and say, I hear you. I know you keep reminding me of what I did earlier this morning with food, or you keep reminding me that I didn't get to exercise this morning, and you kind of keep beating me up over it. So turning towards that part of you, saying, I hear you. I'm choosing recovery, and this is what it looks like. And also thanking that part. Like, the eating disorder is a big part of us that is trying to protect us.
Right.
And so when we can look at it as, this is a protector of my true authentic self, I know it, if we were to really, fuse with the eating disorder and do everything it said, it would really end us down a path that's pretty unhealthy and probably end us up in the hospital. So it ends up not protecting us if we align with it and live by it. We have some fears, and it's really saying, do this and you'll be safe, even though that gets us unhealthy a lot of the times, but knowing that it's trying to protect us. So, and then we have ourselves that we can rely on, of like, I have a vision of recovery. I know what that feels like. I've had recovered meals and snacks before. And so I hear you, eating disorder part. Thank you for trying to protect me. And I'm going to choose recovery, and this is what it looks like. And so moving forward with holding both, I think it can be helpful.
Right. And I love that you teach disorder with such compassion, because I don't really care how people go about recovering, and whatever you need to do to get more recovered, do it. And so sometimes I think it can be really helpful to tell your eating disorder to screw off, just go away, or to get angry with it. But I also do think that there's a lot to be said for recognizing that it does have this adaptive function. It's there for a reason. It was there trying to help you. Anita Johnston talked about this in the other episode, about how trying to teach you and trying to inform you and trying to protect you, ultimately, of course, they're not sustainable, and they will damage your health. But that maybe their intent, or the place that they came out of, was that it's trying to protect us from our fears being realized. Who wants to be judged and rejected, or who wants to be unhealthy? And the eating disorder, I think, offers up this promise that it's going to prevent all of that from happening.
Do you feel like you're eating, this part of you maybe started off with the thought of, hey, let's get healthy. You want to get healthy? Like, doesn't that sound like a good idea?
Yeah.
And a lot of my clients light up. They're like, exactly. That's where it all started from. I just thought I was trying to get healthy. And I started a diet thinking I'm going to have an eating disorder. But that's really what a lot of times can happen. It can start off as this harmless, like, all my friends are dieting, or everyone at work, or fill in the blank. We live in a culture that's very diet obsessed. Compassion, like you were saying, is such a big part. So I do tell my clients, you can ignore the eating disorder. You can try all these things. So try to ignore, you can try to argue, or and when those maybe don't work, Because sometimes they do.
Sometimes they
I had
do.
a client was walking down. She said, I was walking on the street and Ed just showed up out of nowhere and I just hip checked him into traffic.
That's brilliant.
She said it worked and I felt great and I could just move forward on my day. And I said, awesome. So there are times when I like to give my clients options. So if you can argue back and put your hands on your hips and say, no, everyone else is eating this food. I can eat this food as well. I want this food and I'm going to just do my job to see how it feels in my body.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no reason why I'm at a function and I'm the only one that can't eat. So they can try to argue. And then, but we also know how cunning the eating disorder part can be and can argue right back. So sometimes that just perpetuates that internal struggle. And if that's the case, then I say you got to bust into compassion practice and you got to get a compassionate gesture, which not always, but put your hand on your heart, maybe hold your face or give yourself an embrace and give yourself a little bit of pressure and then say some compassionate things. And so I never thought that this was not taught to me in school. I never thought that I would be teaching compete better, but my goodness, it works.
It's effective.
Really well. It is effective. Yeah. And there's even research showing that it is very helpful with eating disorder recovery. So yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of telling people that they get to experiment and see what works for to do in a given day. Because maybe she needed to hip check it that day, and maybe she needs to be kind to the eating disorder the next day and say, "Hey, I hear you. Still not going to do those behaviors." So
right.
I love that. In kind of coming up toward the end of our time to talk with you about is you mentioned diet culture, and I know that one thing that's really difficult for my clients who are recovering, and even for me as a recovered person, is how to help yourself while you're exposed to other people's food rules. I feel like no matter what setting I'm in, I tend to hear all this stuff about this is a good food, this is a bad food, this is healthy, this is not, this is toxic, this is not, this is organic, this is not, all of that stuff. And I think it can be a ton of pressure and it can be really difficult and confusing when you're actively working on your own recovery. So I'm wondering if you have some tips or some strategies for our listeners when they're exposed to other people's rigid all or none thinking.
Yeah, that can be some of the toughest because a lot of times we can't environment that we're in as far as our work environment or school environment, or we have to go back to a family function or any kind of function where, a lot of people today find that it's socially acceptable to talk at length about food and how they eat and what they eat or and health habits. And
right.
So I always remind people that it's not okay to comment on other people's, that's something I would maybe look at ourselves first of do I, do I talk a lot about food with other people, or just noticing where's the topic of conversation and how it gets there maybe. And a lot of that, like I said, is not in our control. But it brings up a lot of different ideas for me. I mean, I always think, I guess the thing that pops in my head would be to look at bound else do and how they're living their life, the foods they're choosing to eat, the exercise or movement that they're choosing to do. Can that be theirs? And can it not turn into, oh my gosh, I'm not doing that, I should be doing, can it not turn into that shame and that shoulding all over, or she doesn't eat that, I shouldn't be eating that, or she eats that, okay, I have to go eat that. Because what that does is it sucks us back up into our head, into all that thinking, and it gets us out of our body. And recovery really is an inside job, and it's about getting into our body regularly. And so when my focus then I'm not doing the work I need to do in recovery, and it's really being preoccupied with what that person's doing, and it's also kind of pulling in that black and white, like this is the way I should be eating this way, or I shouldn't be eating this way. And that's that black and white where we know that we got to legalize all food.
Yeah.
For some of my clients, I mean, this is where the work that I do as a dietitian, yes, the focus is on the food and getting to normalizing the eating experience and food. But it brings up a lot for my clients of like, I thought this was my best friend, and I feel like now I'm realizing we've only the majority of our relationship has been connecting on what diets we're doing, what exercise program we're doing,
with other people in their life,
lost or changed, or so that can bring up a lot of just trying to see what connections and how they're connecting with other people, and is it around food? So
yeah,
it's a little bit of a tangent, but
no, I was just thinking that reminds me.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I actually lost my train of thought. So,
oh, sorry.
Go for it.
Well, I was just thinking how it's kind of similar to noticing how foods feel in your body. It's okay to, without being mean, about how you feel around certain people in general, and also how you feel eating around them, that there are maybe at different points in your recovery, there's some people maybe it's not going to feel as good to eat meals around, and that's okay, and doesn't mean that they're terrible. But I think you can also be mindful of that as well, that if you know that there's a person or people in your life who really love to talk about dieting at every, lunch break at your work, that you can check in and figure out, what do I need to do about that? Is that something I can be able to let that go and not have that expectation of myself? Is that something where I need some space at lunchtime for a while? So I think just noticing also how you feel around other people and hearing about their relationship with food is helpful in making decisions for. And I love how you said recovery is an inside job. That's great. That's so awesome.
Yeah, it really is. And what you said about, giving yourself the time and the space you need. So that doesn't mean you have to end relationships, but maybe now we're in recovery, we want to change our playground and change our playmates. So a lot of times we can't go hang out when we're really active in recovery and choosing recovery. Maybe going to the gym and hanging out with the gym buddies, just maybe that's a trigger at this stage of the game. Maybe later on down the road it will look differently. So giving yourself permission to be mindful of those things, and to notice what conversations trigger us and trigger the behaviors. And maybe that is people at this time. And then over time, you'll get your sea legs, recovery gets stronger. I mean, just living on Earth, living in America, right?
Right.
You're going to see billboards with pictures of foods and commercials and conversations and Instagram pictures and Facebook, and lots of people. And also depending on the time of the year, as a lot of diet talk can happen, and avoid it. So as part of it, and then there are times where people feel that, sometimes it feels inescapable, and that the room that I work in, my office, is where it's a diet-free zone, and there's not going to be any talking about dieting. And clients create ed-free zones or diet-free zones in their home or in their car,
right,
and kind of grow that as in their part of life. But yeah, it's a big part of the work, and it can be just eye-opening to see what's going on and all the obsession about bodies and weight that is really active in our environment.
And that there are good bodies and there are bad bodies, good weights, not good weights, acceptable weights, not acceptable weights. That's still all or none disorder attempting to perpetuate itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, yeah, that just reminds me, just always having them come back to just tuning into what am I reinforcing in this moment? Are my actions reinforcing recovery, or are they reinforcing the thoughts, the ed thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's so helpful. It looks like we're coming toward the end of our time here today. Kate, thank you so much for being a part of this. I'm just delighted and honored, and I know that people listening to this episode are going to get so much out of it. Listeners, that this will be an ongoing conversation about how to have a more balanced relationship with food, how to be kind to yourself and act out of compassion, how to enjoy food more without the behaviors being involved. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I want to thank you so much for, thinking of me, inviting me onto your show. I hope it's the first of many.
Yep, it will be.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of this because I feel like we have to spread the good word of listening to your body and letting it be your guide.
Right. And I also really appreciate recovery history. I think that is not only so helpful to people who are trying to recover or who are recovered, but also to fellow professionals in the field. And I really hope that we can kind of give professionals more permission to say that they have a recovery history as well. I definitely feel like there's some taboo, and I don't know why we should feel like that's off limits. I think it's such an asset. So I'm so happy that you trusted us enough with that really important piece of who you are. I know that people are going to want to connect with you. So if people is KateMerkleNutrition.com, and that's spelled out KateMerkle, nutrition.com. All of the info for all of our guests on the show will always be linked in the show notes, so you can get to it easily. So if you would like to connect with Kate, look at her website or get going through the show notes. So Kate, we're going to let you go for now. Thank you so much for being with us, and we're so excited to talk to you in the future.
Wonderful. I look forward to it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast. This podcast is produced by me, Dr. Janine Anderson,